He was the iron-willed conqueror who changed England forever, but William the Conqueror was also a father. Behind the legends of battlefields and castles stood 10 children born into a dynasty that would reshape Europe. Some inherited crowns, others perished in the forest. A few took vows behind abbey walls. Rivalries split kingdoms, marriages redrew borders, and the family he built fought for generations over the empire he left behind. From Robert Curthose, the crusading duke imprisoned by his own brother, to Adela, the pious countess who gave England another king, this is the complete story of William the Conqueror's sons and daughters, their births, their fates, and how each one carried, or buried, the legacy of the first Norman king. Before we dive into their stories, take a second to hit subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep exploring history's forgotten corners for you. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? I love seeing how many different places and time zones tune in to these journeys through the past. Born around 1051, Robert was the firstborn son of William and Matilda of Flanders, destined from birth to inherit the Duchy of Normandy. His nickname, Curthose, meaning short stockings, supposedly came from his father's mocking reference to his legs, though some chroniclers suggest it referred to a fashion choice that scandalized the Norman court. Whatever its origin, the name captured something essential about Robert. He was never quite what his father expected. By his 20s, Robert had grown restless under his father's authority. In 1077, barely into his prime, he led his first major rebellion against William. The conflict arose from a seemingly trivial incident. His younger brothers Henry and William Rufus had dumped water on him from an upper-story window in Rouen Castle. But Robert's explosive reaction revealed deeper tensions. He demanded independent authority over Normandy, something his father refused to grant to any living son. The rebellion lasted nearly 3 years. Robert fled to Flanders, gathered supporters, and launched raids into Normandy. Father and son even met in single combat at Gerberoy in 1079, where Robert wounded William's horse and nearly killed the conqueror himself. Only papal intervention and family pressure eventually brought reconciliation in 1080, but the damage to their relationship proved permanent. When William died in 1087, Robert finally inherited Normandy, but the duchy came with empty coffers and restless barons. His younger brother William Rufus had received the wealthier prize of England, while Henry got only a payment of silver. Robert's financial struggles would define much of his reign. In 1096, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, and Robert saw both spiritual calling and practical opportunity. Desperate for funds to equip a proper crusading army, he made a fateful decision. He pawned Normandy to his brother William Rufus for 10,000 marks of silver. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, but it placed his inheritance directly in his rival's hands. Robert's crusade proved more successful than his duchy ever had. He fought with distinction at the siege of Antioch and was present at the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. When the Crusader princes offered him the crown of Jerusalem, he declined, a decision that historians debate to this day. Some see it as humility, others as a crucial political miscalculation that cost him a throne. Robert returned to Normandy in 1100 to find his world transformed. William Rufus had died in a hunting accident, and their younger brother Henry had seized the English crown with lightning speed. Henry showed no intention of returning the pawn to duchy, despite Robert's demands. The stage was set for the final fraternal conflict. The brothers' armies met at Tinchebray in 1106. The irony was deliberate. It was exactly 40 years after Hastings, and this time the Norman Duke faced an English king in battle. But Robert's military skills, proven in the Holy Land, could not overcome Henry's superior preparation and resources. The battle lasted barely an hour. Robert was captured, and with him fell the last independent Duchy of Normandy. Henry's treatment of his brother shocked medieval opinion. Rather than exile or ransom, the traditional fate of captured nobles, Robert was imprisoned. For 28 years, until his death in 1134, he remained a prisoner in Cardiff Castle. Some sources suggest he was blinded, others that he lived comfortably but under guard. What is certain is that the once mighty Duke of Normandy, veteran of the First Crusade, spent nearly 3 decades in captivity. Robert's imprisonment became a symbol of fraternal ruthlessness that would haunt the Norman dynasty. His son, William Clito, would spend decades trying to reclaim Normandy, backed by the French king and Robert's old allies. Though these attempts ultimately failed, they kept the duchy in constant turmoil and demonstrated the price of Henry's victory. In the broader sweep of history, Robert's failure marked the permanent unification of England and Normandy under one crown. Where William the Conqueror had ruled two separate domains, Henry I created a true Anglo-Norman empire. But this achievement came at the cost of legitimacy questions that would eventually contribute to the civil war known as the Anarchy. Robert Curthose died as he had lived, at the center of dynastic conflict, a reminder that in medieval politics, even brothers could be enemies. Richard was William and Matilda's second son, born around 1054. Little is recorded of his early life, but as a younger son of the Conqueror, he would have been destined for either the church or a life of service to his elder brother. The Norman chroniclers, so detailed about Robert's rebellions and later achievements, tell us almost nothing about Richard's personality or education. What we do know comes from the circumstances of his death. In the early 1070s, while still a young man, Richard was hunting in the New Forest, the vast woodland preserve his father had created by clearing villages across Hampshire. The date is uncertain, but most historians place it around 1074, making Richard perhaps 20 years old when he died. The accident itself was brutally simple. Richard was struck by a stag and killed instantly. Medieval hunting was a dangerous pursuit. Nobles hunted with spears and arrows at close quarters, on horseback in thick forest. Accidents were common enough that most received little comment, but Richard's death in the New Forest would prove grimly prophetic. Richard was buried at Winchester Cathedral, the ancient seat of English kingship that his father had revived. The simple entry in the cathedral's records gives no hint of special ceremony or particular grief. He was simply Richard, son of King William, killed by a stag in the New Forest. But the location of his death would resonate through Norman history. 26 years later, his brother William Rufus would die in the same forest under circumstances far more suspicious. Medieval chroniclers, with their love of divine patterns, would see Richard's death as a warning ignored. The New Forest, created by displacing English peasants for Norman sport, seemed to claim royal blood in return. Richard's death left the succession remarkably clear. Robert remained heir to Normandy, William Rufus to England, and Henry to whatever he could secure for himself. In a family defined by rivalry and rebellion, Richard's early death spared him from the conflicts that would tear his brothers apart. Yet it also meant that one fewer prince would share the inheritance, concentrating power among the survivors and perhaps making their eventual conflicts more intense. Of all William's children, Richard remains the most shadowy, a prince whose life was too brief to make history, but whose death became part of a larger pattern of royal misfortune in the forests of Hampshire. His grave at Winchester stands as a reminder that even royal birth offered no protection from the casual violence of medieval life. Born around 1056, William Rufus was named for his father but earned his nickname from his ruddy complexion and red hair. Contemporary chroniclers described him as short, stocky, and quick-tempered, with a voice that could fill a hall and a presence that dominated any room. Unlike his scholarly younger brother Henry or his pious sisters, Rufus seemed to embody the raw military energy of the Norman conquest. When the conqueror died at Rouen in 1087, he reportedly designated Rufus as his heir to England, while Robert inherited Normandy. But Rufus had to fight for his throne. He rushed to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and had himself crowned within days. His speed proved crucial. Several Norman barons preferred Robert and quickly organized a rebellion to unite the two realms under the elder brother. Rufus crushed the 1088 rebellion with a combination of English support and ruthless efficiency. He promised the English better laws and lighter taxes, promises he largely ignored once secure. His 13-year reign was marked by constant warfare, heavy taxation, and conflicts with the church that scandalized his contemporaries. The king's relationship with religion proved particularly controversial. He kept the Archbishopric of Canterbury vacant for 4 years, seizing its revenues for the crown. When finally forced to appoint Anselm in 1093, he immediately clashed with the scholarly monk over church independence. Rufus treated ecclesiastical positions as sources of income, selling bishoprics and abbacies to the highest bidder. His personal life generated constant rumor and speculation. Rufus never married and left no acknowledged children. Medieval chroniclers, most of them churchmen, wrote darkly of his court's moral corruption and his own unnatural lifestyle. Modern historians debate whether these accounts reflect genuine scandals or clerical hostility to a king who treated the church as a source of revenue rather than spiritual authority. On August 2nd, 1100, Rufus went hunting in the same New Forest where his brother Richard had died decades earlier. The king's hunting party included Walter Tyrrell, a French nobleman and skilled archer. According to the only detailed account written by chronicler William of Malmesbury decades later, Tyrrell shot an arrow at a stag, missed, and struck the king in the chest. Tyrrell immediately fled to France, and the rest of the hunting party scattered. Rufus was found dead by local peasants, his body abandoned beneath a tree. They loaded the corpse onto a charcoal burner's cart and brought it to Winchester Cathedral, where blood reportedly dripped from the cart all the way to the church door. The circumstances immediately raised suspicions. Tyrrell was an expert marksman, unlikely to lose such an errant shot. The king's brother Henry was in the hunting party and rode directly to Winchester to claim the treasury and crown. Within 3 days, Henry was King of England, having moved with a speed that suggested either remarkable opportunism or careful preparation. Whether accident or assassination, Rufus's death ended the most controversial reign in Norman England. The church chroniclers who despised him saw divine judgment in his forest death, noting that he died unconfessed and unrepentant. His hastily organized funeral at Winchester was notably modest for a king, with few tears shed by clergy or nobles. Yet Rufus had proven an effective ruler despite his moral failings. He had maintained England's borders, suppressed rebellions, and accumulated vast wealth through his tax policies. His death allowed Henry to reunite England and Normandy, but it also demonstrated the fragility of Norman succession. In a dynasty where brothers fought brothers, even hunting accidents could reshape kingdoms. The Red King's legacy remained dark for centuries, shaped by clerical chroniclers who saw him as a tyrant and blasphemer. Only in recent decades have historians begun to reassess his reign, recognizing his administrative efficiency and military success. But questions about his death in the New Forest, the same forest that claimed his brother Richard, continue to fascinate those who study the violent dynamics of Norman royal family. Henry was born around 1068, the youngest of William and Matilda's sons, and the only one born after the conquest in England. This timing proved significant. While his elder brothers grew up as continental nobles, Henry was shaped by Anglo-Norman culture from birth. Contemporary sources emphasize his education, earning him the epithet Beauclerc, or fine scholar, unusual praise for a prince in an age when literacy was rare among the nobility. When William the Conqueror died in 1087, Henry received no land inheritance, only 5,000 pounds of silver, a fortune in coins, but no kingdom to rule. This apparent disadvantage proved crucial to his character. While Robert and Rufus fought over duchies and crowns, Henry learned to think strategically, to wait for opportunities, and to value competent administration over romantic gestures. Henry's moment came on that August morning in 1100 when Rufus died in the New Forest. While others fled the scene or stood in shock, Henry rode straight to Winchester and claimed the royal treasury. Within 3 days, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. His speed was breathtaking and suspicious to many who wondered if the hunting accident had been quite so accidental. His first acts as king revealed careful preparation. He immediately issued a Charter of Liberties, promising to end his brother's abusive practices and restore traditional English laws. He recalled Archbishop Anselm from exile and married Edith of Scotland, descendant of the old English royal house. These moves won him crucial support from both church and English nobility while his brother Robert was still returning from crusade. When Robert finally returned in 1101 and claimed the English throne, Henry was ready. He had rebuilt the royal administration, secured his borders, and gathered resources for the inevitable conflict. The decisive battle came at Tinchebray in 1106, where Henry's carefully planned assault destroyed Robert's army in less than an hour. With Robert's capture, Henry became Duke of Normandy as well as King of England. Henry's 35-year reign transformed the Anglo-Norman kingdom into a sophisticated administrative state. He expanded the royal bureaucracy, standardized legal procedures, and created new forms of record-keeping that made royal government more efficient than anything seen in Western Europe. The pipe rolls, detailed financial records of his reign, show a king obsessed with administrative detail and fiscal accountability. Unlike his brothers, Henry understood that lasting power required more than military victory. He promoted talented administrators regardless of their birth, created a professional civil service, and established legal procedures that survived long after his death. His court attracted scholars and clerics from across Europe, making it a center of learning as well as government. He also managed the delicate balance between his English and Norman subjects more skillfully than any previous ruler. His marriage to Edith of Scotland, whom he renamed Matilda, produced children with both Norman and English royal blood. He retained Norman military efficiency while adopting English administrative traditions, creating a truly integrated kingdom. Henry's personal life was notably complex, even by royal standards. His marriage to Matilda of Scotland produced two legitimate children, Matilda, born around 1102, and William, Aetheling, born around 1103. But Henry also acknowledged at least 20 illegitimate children by various mistresses, more than any other English king. He used these children strategically, marrying daughters to important nobles and placing sons in key positions throughout his domains. The crown's future seemed secure until November 25, 1120, when disaster struck in the English Channel. Henry's son and heir, William Aetheling, was traveling from Normandy to England aboard the White Ship, the finest vessel in the royal fleet. The ship struck a rock near Barfleur and sank with almost all hands. William drowned along with two of Henry's illegitimate children and much of the young Anglo-Norman nobility. Contemporary chroniclers reported that no one dared tell Henry the news directly. When a young page finally informed him, the king reportedly collapsed and never smiled again. The tragedy destroyed more than Henry's family. It shattered the succession and created a crisis that would outlast his reign. With William dead, Henry's only legitimate heir was his daughter Matilda, but no woman had ever ruled England or Normandy in her own right. Henry spent his final 15 years trying to secure Matilda's succession. In 1127, he forced his nobles to swear allegiance to her as his heir. He arranged her marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, creating an alliance that should have strengthened her claim. But many nobles remained uncomfortable with female rule, and Henry's nephew Stephen of Blois, son of his sister Adela, had his own royal ambitions. When Henry died on December 1, 1135, allegedly from eating a surfeit of lampreys despite his doctor's warnings, the succession crisis immediately erupted. Stephen raced to England and claimed the crown before Matilda could react. The result was 19 years of civil war known as the Anarchy, a conflict that devastated England and demonstrated the fragility of even the most carefully planned dynastic arrangements. Henry I had been the most successful of William's sons, uniting England and Normandy under efficient government and creating the administrative foundations of medieval monarchy. But his greatest achievement, a centralized bureaucratic state, could not survive the succession crisis caused by his son's death in the White Ship. The Scholar King's legacy would be governmental innovation and dynastic failure, progress and catastrophe intertwined in the complex inheritance of the Norman conquest. Cecilia was born around 1055, the eldest daughter of William and Matilda, and her fate was determined before her birth. Medieval noble families routinely dedicated children to religious life, both for spiritual reasons and practical politics. As the first daughter, Cecilia was designated for the church, a decision that would shape not only her life but also her family's relationship with Norman religious institutions. While still a child, Cecilia was sent to the Abbey of Holy Trinity in Caen, founded by her mother Matilda around 1059. This was not unusual. Noble daughters often began their religious education young, though their final vows waited until they reached maturity. At Holy Trinity, Cecilia received an education that was remarkable for its time: Latin literature, religious theology, administration, and the complex skills needed to manage large ecclesiastical estates. Cecilia took her final vows sometime in the 1070s and became abbess of Holy Trinity around 1113, a position she would hold until her death. As abbess, she controlled vast estates across Normandy and England, managed hundreds of nuns and lay workers, and wielded influence that extended far beyond her convent walls. Medieval abbesses were among the most powerful women of their era, and Cecilia proved particularly adept at using her family connections for her abbey's benefit. Under her leadership, Holy Trinity became one of Normandy's wealthiest and most influential religious houses. She secured royal grants from her brothers, negotiated with bishops and secular lords, and carefully managed the abbey's extensive property holdings. Surviving documents show her authorizing land grants, settling legal disputes, and corresponding with nobles across the Norman domains. Her position also made her a crucial link between the Norman royal family and the church. When conflicts arose between her brothers and ecclesiastical authorities, Cecilia often served as an intermediary, using her religious authority and family connections to broker compromises. This role became particularly important during the investiture controversies that plagued Henry I's reign. Cecilia's religious life served important dynastic functions beyond mere personal salvation. Her prayers and those of her nuns were believed to provide spiritual protection for the royal family. When her brothers went to war, campaigned in distant lands, or faced political crises, Cecilia's abbey offered masses and prayers for their success and safety. She also maintained the family's religious reputation during politically difficult periods. When William Rufus clashed with the church over revenues and appointments, Cecilia's exemplary religious life helped maintain the dynasty's spiritual credibility. Her presence in such a prestigious abbey demonstrated that the Norman royal family remained committed to Christian virtue even when individual kings pursued controversial policies. The abbess played a particularly important role in commemoration and family memory. Holy Trinity housed the tomb of Queen Matilda, and Cecilia ensured that proper masses were said for her mother's soul. She also commissioned religious artwork and manuscripts that celebrated Norman achievements while emphasizing their divine sanction. Cecilia died on July 13, 1126, after more than 50 years of religious life and 13 years as abbess. Contemporary chroniclers praised her piety, administrative skill, and the prosperity she had brought to Holy Trinity. She was buried in the abbey church beside her mother Matilda, in a tomb that emphasized both her royal birth and religious achievements. Her death came at a crucial moment in Norman history, just 6 years after the White Ship disaster and 9 years before Henry I's own death. As one of the last surviving children of William the Conqueror, her passing marked the end of an era. The generation that had lived through the conquest and its immediate aftermath was giving way to new rulers who would face different challenges. Cecilia's legacy extended far beyond her individual life. Under her leadership, Holy Trinity had become a model for female religious communities throughout the Norman domains. Her administrative innovations influenced abbey management across medieval Europe. Most importantly, she had demonstrated how a royal daughter could wield real power through religious institutions, creating a template that future generations of noble women would follow. In the broader context of William the Conqueror's family, Cecilia represented the successful integration of religious devotion and political pragmatism that characterized the best of Norman rulership. While her brothers fought over earthly kingdoms, she built a spiritual empire that outlasted their military conquests and provided stability during the dynasty's most turbulent periods. Constance was born around 1061, the second daughter of William and Matilda, and her life was shaped by the complex marriage diplomacy of medieval Europe. Unlike her elder sister Cecilia, who was destined for religious life, Constance was reserved for a political marriage that would extend Norman influence into the Celtic borderlands of Brittany. Around 1086, when she was in her mid-20s, Constance married Alan IV Fergant, Duke of Brittany. This alliance served multiple strategic purposes for the Norman dynasty. Brittany controlled the approaches to Normandy from the west and had traditionally maintained independence from both French and Norman influence. By marrying into the Breton ducal family, William secured his western flank while gaining potential allies for future conflicts. The marriage also reflected the elevated status Norman women had achieved through the conquest's success. Constance was not merely a bride sent to secure an alliance. She brought substantial dowry lands and maintained connections to the Norman court that made her a significant political figure in her own right. As Duchess of Brittany, Constance found herself navigating the complex cultural landscape of a Celtic duchy that maintained its own language, laws, and traditions, while increasingly coming under French and Norman influence. Brittany in the late 11th century was a patchwork of local lordships, ecclesiastical territories, and ducal domains that required careful management and diplomatic skill. Contemporary records suggest that Constance adapted successfully to Breton court life while maintaining her Norman connections. She appears in charter witness lists alongside her husband, indicating her involvement in ducal governance. The couple had several children, including Alan Fee, who would later become Duke of Brittany and continue the dynasty that linked Breton and Norman interests. Her position as Duchess also made her a crucial link in the broader network of Norman political alliances. When her brothers faced rebellions or external threats, Constance could potentially call upon Breton military support. When Breton interests conflicted with French royal policy, she provided a channel for Norman diplomatic intervention. Constance died in 1090, still in her 20s and at the height of her political influence. Her death occurred during a period of particular tension in Breton politics, as various factions struggled for control over the duchy's relationship with the emerging Angevin power in Maine and Anjou. Contemporary chroniclers reported rumors that Constance had been poisoned, though they provided no details about possible perpetrators or motives. Such rumors were common when prominent figures died young, particularly in the politically charged atmosphere of medieval courts. The suggestion of poison may have reflected genuine suspicions or simply the tendency to see conspiracy behind any unexpected death. If the poisoning rumors had any basis in fact, the most likely explanation would be Breton factional politics rather than external enemies. As a Norman princess wielding influence in Breton affairs, Constance may have threatened local nobles who preferred to maintain independence from Norman oversight. Alternatively, her death might have resulted from broader conflicts between pro-French and pro-Norman factions within the Breton nobility. Constance's death significantly weakened the Norman position in Brittany, just as William the Conqueror's own death in 1087 had begun to fragment the Anglo-Norman Empire. Without her influence, the marriage alliance between Normandy and Brittany became less effective, and subsequent Breton dukes proved more willing to ally with French royal interests against Norman expansion. Her widower, Alan IV, eventually remarried, but the new alliance did not carry the same political weight as his marriage to a daughter of the Conqueror. This shift contributed to the broader realignment of Western French politics that would challenge Norman hegemony throughout the reign of Henry I. In the context of William's family legacy, Constance's brief life and mysterious death illustrated both the potential and the fragility of using marriage alliances to extend dynastic influence. Her marriage had successfully extended Norman power into previously independent territories, but her early death demonstrated how quickly such arrangements could unravel when key personalities were removed from the political equation. Constance remains one of the more shadowy figures among William's children, known primarily through her political role rather than personal characteristics. Yet her story reveals the crucial part that royal daughters played in the expansion and maintenance of Norman power, serving as diplomatic bridges between cultures and political systems that might otherwise have remained hostile to Norman interests. Born around 1067, Adela was the youngest daughter of William and Matilda and the only one born after the conquest. This timing shaped her entire life. While her elder sisters grew up in Normandy during the uncertain years before 1066, Adela was raised in the confident atmosphere of post-conquest England, where Norman rule seemed divinely ordained and permanently established. Her education reflected this new reality. Unlike earlier noble daughters who received primarily domestic training with basic literacy, Adela learned Latin, theology, law, and administration. Contemporary sources describe her as remarkably learned for a woman of her era, capable of discussing complex theological questions with bishops and legal matters with royal administrators. This intellectual sophistication was intentional preparation for her political destiny. By the time Adela reached marriage age, the Norman dynasty needed alliances with the great French noble families who still viewed the Normans as upstart conquerors. An intellectually impressive bride could help legitimize Norman claims to equality with the ancient nobility of France. Around 1083, Adela married Stephen II, Count of Blois, one of the wealthiest and most powerful lords in France. The marriage alliance was strategically brilliant. Blois controlled key territories along the Loire Valley that could threaten Norman interests in Maine and Anjou, but as allies, the Blois domains provided a buffer against French royal expansion toward Normandy. The match also elevated Norman prestige significantly. The House of Blois traced its lineage back to Charlemagne and represented the old Frankish nobility that had initially resisted Norman expansion. By marrying into this family, Adela helped transform the Normans from foreign conquerors into legitimate members of the French aristocratic hierarchy. Adela and Stephen had at least 9 children, including the future King Stephen of England and Henry, who would become Bishop of Winchester. This large family gave Adela numerous opportunities to arrange strategic marriages and ecclesiastical appointments that extended her influence throughout Western Europe. When Stephen departed for the First Crusade in 1096, Adela became regent of Blois, governing the county during his absence. Medieval chronicles praised her administrative competence and political skill during this period. She maintained order, collected revenues, and managed the complex web of feudal obligations that bound the Blois territories together. Her regency became permanent when Stephen died at the Siege of Ramla in 1102. Rather than remarry or surrender power to male relatives, Adela continued ruling Blois as regent for her young son Theobald. For more than 2 decades, she was effectively a reigning countess, wielding authority that few women of her era could match. Her rule was notably successful. She expanded Blois territory through careful marriages and strategic alliances, maintained excellent relations with the church, and accumulated wealth that made her court one of the most splendid in France. Contemporary writers compared her favorably to the legendary queens of antiquity, praising both her political wisdom and her patronage of learning. Adela's most consequential political decision came in 1135, when her brother Henry I died without a clear male heir. Henry had designated his daughter Matilda as successor, but many Norman nobles remained uncomfortable with female rule. Adela encouraged her son Stephen to claim the English throne, providing both financial support and political justification for his coup. Stephen's successful seizure of the crown transformed Adela from a French countess into the mother of an English king. She had effectively restored the Norman dynasty's male succession while advancing her own family's interests. The irony was pointed. The daughter who had never been considered for inheritance herself had engineered the accession of her son to the throne her brothers had fought over. However, Stephen's reign proved turbulent, as Matilda and her supporters fought to reclaim what they saw as her rightful inheritance. The resulting civil war, known as the Anarchy, devastated England for nearly 20 years. Adela lived to see the beginning of this conflict but died before its resolution. In her final years, Adela retired to the Abbey of Marsigny, where she lived as a nun while maintaining her political influence. Even in religious retirement, she continued to advise her sons and manage family affairs. Her letters from this period reveal a woman who remained intellectually engaged and politically astute well into old age. Adela died on March 8, 1137, having outlived all her siblings except her youngest brother Henry. Her death marked the end of the generation that had directly experienced the conquest and its immediate aftermath. She had lived to see the Norman dynasty evolve from continental adventurers to established European royalty. Of all William the Conqueror's children, Adela achieved perhaps the most remarkable synthesis of personal agency and dynastic loyalty. She had used her marriage to advance Norman interests while building independent political power. Her son's kingship represented both the continuation of her father's legacy and her own political triumph, proof that in medieval politics the most influential players were not always those who inherited thrones, but those who determined who would sit upon them. Adaliza, also known as Adelaide in some sources, remains among the most obscure of William the Conqueror's daughters. Born around 1065, she appears in few contemporary records, and much of what we know about her comes from later chroniclers whose accounts are often contradictory and historically questionable. The most intriguing and disputed claim about Adaliza concerns a possible betrothal to Harold Godwinson before the Norman conquest. Some chroniclers suggest that William had promised one of his daughters to the English king as part of diplomatic negotiations in the early 1060s. If true, this would have made Adaliza briefly the betrothed of the man her father would later defeat at Hastings. However, modern historians treat this story with considerable skepticism. The chronology is problematic. Adaliza would have been an infant when such negotiations supposedly occurred. More likely, the tale represents later attempts to legitimize the Norman conquest by suggesting that Harold had broken faith with William not only over the crown, but also over marriage agreements. What is certain is that Adaliza entered religious life, though the specific institution and timing remain unclear. Unlike her sister Cecilia, who was destined from birth for the prestigious Abbey of Holy Trinity at Caen, Adaliza seems to have chosen religious vocation later in life, possibly after the failure of marriage negotiations or personal spiritual calling. Some sources place her at the Abbey of Saint-Léger in Préaux, a Norman convent that housed several daughters of noble families. Others suggest she may have spent time in England, possibly at one of the religious houses that William and Matilda had founded or endowed after the conquest. Her religious life appears to have been far less prominent than Cecilia's. While Cecilia became abbess of a major Norman institution and wielded considerable political influence, Adaliza seems to have lived in relative obscurity, perhaps by choice, or perhaps because she lacked the family connections and political support that elevated her sister to high ecclesiastical office. Adaliza died sometime before 1113 when she was commemorated in the memory rolls of several Norman religious houses. These necrologies, lists of the dead for whom prayers were to be said, provide the most reliable evidence of her existence and approximate date of death. The fact that multiple institutions remembered her in prayer suggests that despite her obscurity in political records, Adaliza had achieved some reputation for piety within Norman religious circles. Such commemorations were typically reserved for individuals who had made significant contributions to religious life or who came from families that had endowed the institutions in question. Adaliza's primary historical legacy lies not in political achievements or religious leadership, but in the very fact of her commemoration. The memory rolls that record her death provide valuable evidence of how Norman religious institutions maintained connections across their network of monasteries and convents. Her inclusion in these records also demonstrates the continued importance of the Conqueror's family in Norman religious consciousness. Even relatively obscure members of the dynasty received special commemoration, suggesting that William's descendants maintained spiritual significance long after their political influence had waned. In the broader context of William's family, Adaliza represents the daughters whose lives did not achieve the political prominence of Adela or the religious leadership of Cecilia. Her story reminds us that even royal families included members who lived quietly, whose contributions were spiritual rather than political, and whose legacies survived primarily in the prayers of religious communities rather than the chronicles of political historians. The obscurity that surrounds Adaliza also reflects the limitations of medieval record-keeping and the bias of chroniclers toward politically active figures. Royal daughters who entered religious life but did not become abbesses, who made spiritual rather than political contributions, often disappeared from historical narrative despite living lives that their contemporaries considered exemplary and worthy of commemoration. Matilda, named for her mother, appears in historical records only as a brief entry in the Domesday Book of 1086, where she is listed among the landholders in certain English counties. This single reference provides virtually our only concrete evidence of her existence, making her perhaps the most mysterious of all William the Conqueror's children. The Domesday entry suggests that even as a child, Matilda held property in her own right, an unusual arrangement that indicates William intended her for a significant marriage alliance or perhaps anticipated her entering religious life as a wealthy abbess. The specific lands mentioned in the survey were located in areas of strategic importance, suggesting careful planning for her future role. Matilda appears to have died very young, probably sometime in the late 1080s or early 1090s, before reaching marriage age. No chronicler records the circumstances of her death, and no contemporary source mentions her burial, suggesting that she died as a child when such losses were common and often considered too routine for detailed chronicling. Later traditions, preserved in monastic chronicles from the 12th century, suggest that she was buried at Holy Trinity Abbey in Caen alongside her mother and sister Cecilia. However, these accounts were written decades after her death and may represent attempts to provide a respectable final resting place for a forgotten royal daughter rather than historical fact. The lack of contemporary mourning records or funeral descriptions suggests that Matilda's death, while certainly noted by her family, did not carry the political implications that would have accompanied the loss of an older daughter with established marriage prospects or religious commitments. Matilda's obscurity in historical records ironically makes her one of the most important of William's children for understanding medieval family dynamics. Her brief appearance in the Domesday Book, followed by silence, reveals how even royal children could disappear from history if they died before achieving political or religious prominence. Her story also illustrates the high infant and child mortality rates that affected even the most privileged families in medieval Europe. While chroniclers carefully recorded the deeds of surviving adult children, those who died young often merited only brief mentions in land surveys or legal documents. The fact that William granted her lands recorded in Domesday suggests that he planned futures for all his children, male and female alike. Matilda's property holdings indicate that she was not simply overlooked or considered politically insignificant because of her gender. Rather, her early death prevented whatever plans her father had made for her from coming to fruition. In the context of the Norman royal family's dynastic struggles, Matilda's early death meant one fewer potential claimant to divided inheritances, one fewer marriage alliance to complicate succession disputes, and one fewer religious figure to mediate family conflicts. Her absence from the political struggles of the 1090s and beyond may have simplified some of the complex family dynamics that characterized William's legacy, though we can only speculate about what role she might have played had she survived to adulthood. Agatha exists primarily in the realm of historical speculation and scholarly debate. Some medieval chroniclers mention a daughter of William the Conqueror who was betrothed to Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, one of the most powerful Christian kings in Iberia during the late 11th century. If this betrothal occurred, it would have represented the furthest extension of Norman diplomatic reach under William's reign. The proposed marriage alliance would have made strategic sense for both kingdoms. Alfonso was leading the Christian reconquest of Iberia from Muslim rulers and needed allies against both Islamic forces and rival Christian kingdoms. William, meanwhile, sought to legitimize Norman rule through marriages with established European dynasties. Modern historians remain deeply divided about whether Agatha actually existed as a separate individual. Some scholars argue that chroniclers confused her with one of William's other daughters, particularly Adaliza, or the younger Matilda. Others suggest that the name Agatha represents a scribal error or misunderstanding of documentary evidence. The primary evidence for Agatha's existence comes from Spanish chronicles that mention a Norman princess who was betrothed to Alfonso, but never actually married him. However, these sources were written decades or centuries after the supposed events, and their reliability is questionable. No contemporary Norman or English sources mention such a betrothal. Whether or not Agatha existed as a historical individual, her story symbolizes the ambitious scope of Norman diplomatic aspirations in the late 11th century. The very possibility that William would have considered marrying a daughter to the King of Leon demonstrates how far Norman influence had extended beyond their original territories in northern France. The debate over her existence also illustrates the challenges historians face when studying medieval women, particularly royal daughters whose lives were often recorded only in relation to marriage negotiations or religious commitments. The documentary evidence for Agatha, if she existed, has not survived the centuries, leaving us with tantalizing hints and scholarly speculation. In the context of William's family legacy, the question of Agatha represents the limits of historical knowledge and the dangers of accepting later chroniclers' accounts without contemporary corroboration. Her disputed existence serves as a reminder that even royal genealogies contain uncertainties, and that the medieval documentary record, detailed as it sometimes appears, still leaves significant gaps in our understanding of family relationships and political negotiations. When William the Conqueror died at Rouen in September 1087, he left behind an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Loire Valley, 10 children who would carry his legacy in various directions, and a succession arrangement that satisfied no one completely. The division of his lands between Robert and William Rufus, with Henry receiving only silver, set the stage for decades of fraternal warfare that would reshape medieval Europe. Henry II's victory at Tinchebray in 1106 seemingly resolved the succession crisis by reuniting England and Normandy under one crown. For 30 years, Henry ruled an integrated Anglo-Norman state more efficiently and prosperously than either of his predecessors. Yet his success proved temporary. When his son William Atheling drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, the carefully constructed unity began to unravel. The civil war known as the Anarchy, which followed Henry's death in 1135, represented the final failure of the Norman dynastic system that William had established. His nephew Stephen, son of Adela, claimed the throne against Henry's daughter Matilda, creating a conflict that devastated England for nearly 20 years. The irony was complete. The dynasty that had brought unprecedented unity to England through conquest ultimately tore the kingdom apart through competing inheritance claims. Yet the legacy of William's children extended far beyond political failure. Cecilia's religious leadership helped establish the Norman Church as a center of learning and reform. Adela's political acumen demonstrated how royal women could wield influence across generations. Even Robert's failures in Normandy contributed to the administrative innovations that Henry I used to create medieval Europe's most efficient government. The Norman conquest had succeeded too well. It created not just a new ruling dynasty, but a new form of kingship that demanded skills none of William's immediate heirs fully possessed. The administrative state that grew from Anglo-Norman government would outlast the family that created it, evolving through Plantagenet, Lancastrian, and Yorkist dynasties until it became the foundation of modern English monarchy. In the end, William the Conqueror's greatest achievement was not military conquest, but institutional creation. His children inherited kingdoms. Their descendants would inherit a system of government sophisticated enough to survive dynastic collapse and political revolution. The 10 children who carried Norman blood into the 12th century had collectively transformed medieval kingship from personal rule into institutional authority, a transformation that neither William nor any of his contemporaries could have anticipated. The Norman dynasty that began with adventurous conquest ended in administrative routine, but that transformation proved more lasting than any military victory. In the complex fates of William's children, their successes and failures, their innovations and mistakes, lay the foundations of medieval European government and the distant origins of modern constitutional monarchy.